Well, welcome everyone to our interview with Stephanie at the Cycling With Summit, which is a celebration of the bicycle and riders who are breaking down all kinds of barriers. My name is Annalisa, and I'm the founder and co-creator of Miles of Portraits, which is a series documenting the people we meet on our bicycle travels, people like Stephanie and other people featured on this summit. And before we begin, I wanted to just give a quick shout out to our sponsors, Ortlieb, Rad Power Bikes, all of the other brands that got behind the summit, as well as our Patreon supporters for making all of this possible. Stephanie, I actually met through iZUMi, which is funny because I feel like I meet so many cyclists through that brand, through their ambassador program. She is an adventure cyclist who uses the bicycle not just as a vehicle for, freedom, but also for racial justice. She is possibly the only Black woman to have biked across the TransAm route. She's still trying to figure that out, but so far she hasn't heard of any other Black women who have done it. She's the leader of Denver's Black Girls Do Bike chapter. She is one of the leaders of the Denver Solidarity Rides, which is a peaceful protest ride through Denver. So with that, I'm really honored to welcome Stephanie to the summit. And Stephanie, if you could start off by letting us know kind of how you got into biking and bike touring.
Sure. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate everyone's support and happy to be here. And thank you, Annalisa and Eric, for being part of this. And yeah, so how I got into biking. It's interesting, and I appreciate the question because every time I ask folks about this, there always seems to be some kind of unique path, and it isn't just, oh, I grew up doing it. So I started with just like 2 childhood bikes as a kid, and that was very short-lived. I won a bike at a raffle, and I was pretty old at that time. I think I was like 9 or 10. All things considered, most people know how to ride a bike, I think, by then. So I ultimately grew out of it, and then in middle school, I got another bike, and it was stolen after the second time that I rode it, unfortunately. And then I didn't have a bike again until I was 22 years old. So it was my senior year in college. I have a friend in Miami, so that's where I grew up, and that's also where I went to undergrad. And my friend Lewis, he biked like with his family, like with his cousins, and he introduced me to the fixed gear bike. And I feel like that was the time in my mind, I feel like where it was like very like salient. I feel like everybody was very into fixed gears, and I lived in Miami, so it was suitable. There's no hills, and so I ultimately ended up buying one. And it was really kind of in some ways through his influence, but after I bought it, I never really rode with him. I mostly rode by myself, and it was just kind of my own activity that I did on my own. A lot of my friends actually, when I wrote a piece for Adventure Cycling, a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, read it. And I remember she gave me the feedback that she was like, "You didn't start writing in Miami, you liar." And I was like, "No, I did. I just didn't tell you about it." I just didn't really tell anyone. I just kind of, it was in some ways just something that I was trying to like figure out for myself, particularly because Miami doesn't really have the great infrastructure to support it. And I was riding a lot on sidewalks and just, picking places I wanted to go to and figuring out how to get there. So yeah, that's how I got into it really. So my time in Miami as a cyclist was pretty short-lived until I moved to Denver, and that's what really kind of expanded my horizons here. Just not only because there's better infrastructure, not great, but better. More of an embedded cycling culture here, more enthusiasts in general, more paths. I could meet someone that commutes by bike here, or either riding for fitness or going to the grocery store on their bikes. That's a very normal thing to observe here. Definitely a rarity in Miami.
So eventually you did transition into bike touring. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it was that convinced you to join your partner, Austin, on your cross-country trip. And if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So it's just interesting because I bought my bike like early 2014, this fixed year that I mentioned in Miami. I moved to Denver late May, and the tour was in 2016. So I didn't own a bike before 2014. And 2016, I was biking across the country. So that was totally unforeseen, unplanned. Just, the stars aligned to allow something like that to happen. But, it's a very unparalleled kind of formative experience for me. But my boyfriend at that time had learned about the TransAm 8 years prior. And he had just kind of told himself after he learned about it that at some point he'll do it, maybe when he retired, whatever, just essentially when he had the time and the capacity to do something like that. And he had told me about that, and that was just kind of it. We talked about it, and that's all. At that point, we were both in grad school. He was working through an internship that was going to end when grad school also ended. So because he hadn't secured a job, it was just kind of the time worked out. And he was like, I'm going to do this after graduation. And it was, again, a good time because he didn't have to quit a job, but also because it was summer, and it's kind of like in some ways a reward for, having earned our masters. So at this point, I had no interest, definitely didn't feel like I had the capacity. It was just, it wasn't my dream, it was his. But ultimately things just kind of, it's almost like the puzzle pieces kind of came together. A part of it was me biking more, and kind of being more, and just learning more about cycling and developing, myself as a cyclist. Another part of it was, I was also going to be ending, we're going to be graduating at the same time. And at that point, I was actually working full time for the same university that we were in, but I was ready to move on from the position that I was in. And apart from that, just like seeing him, he was buying the maps from Adventure Cycling, and I was just looking at it and just thinking like, whoa, this looks incredible, but also you go do it. And just, he kind of like twisted my arm, but he wasn't putting too much pressure on it. What he did do to twist my arm was he would show me different videos of people touring and women touring specifically, and kind of trying to make me a little bit more comfortable, and also showing me that the people that do this are have all kinds of different experiences, that it's not that people are training for 7 years, day in and day out to be able to do something like this. It's just regular people that just want a challenge, or are kind of thrown into it, or however it may be. So ultimately, I really do think like all of the conditions just kind of aligned between, again, like my job, and just like, I think my sense of thrill, like personally, was really like magnified at that time. Like having been in Denver for only 2 years, like I feel like that's where I started learning about like anything that had to do with like recreation and outdoor spaces. Like that's just not a world that I previously navigated in Miami. Like the outdoors in Miami, to me at least, was just going to the beach. So we definitely set out to do it, in a very thoughtful and methodical fashion, but it was also kind of impulsive. It was just kind of this thing like, yeah, I want to challenge myself in that way. And even though I had never done something like that, or challenge myself in a way that brings about cycling, I am kind of prone to doing like difficult and challenging things. Like that's just kind of my nature. And part of it is also just doing some like personal reflection and feeling like, those kind of self-imposed limitations were really what was contributing to that fear that I felt, because above anything else, I just felt fear of like a car is going to hit me or whatever. And I feel like, slowly but surely he really, like Austin, my partner, started kind of eroding that, and making me feel like it was a real possibility, and that, by virtue of us doing it together, that we could look out for each other and keep each other safe. And we just kind of, I bought the bike. I started, buying the bike bags and this and that and the maps and all this kind of stuff, and it worked itself out.
Eric and I actually didn't really do any training for the Trans Am. We rode like 50 miles one day. But I think you learn the most just by jumping in. And Amalia, one of the speakers who was featured in this summit, she was talking about how her very first triathlon in San Francisco, she didn't really do a lot of research. It was kind of a spontaneous thing that she did with her colleagues. And she said that if she hadn't done her research or learned that there's a possibility of sharks in the the San Francisco Bay, that she wouldn't have like done it. So sometimes it's great to just not think
I
too
feel
much.
like we did research, but like just enough. I mean, ultimately,
Right.
like I don't think anything anyone can tell you will prepare you for everything that you ultimately encounter. Because even for other people that have done the Trans Am, like their experiences could vary for a number of reasons. But yeah, I am all about that, of just doing it, like just and I think that's one of the videos that Austin had shown me. I think it was two women that were going from Chicago to San Francisco or somewhere in California, and they were kind of talking about that, of this idea of just kind of going with it. And there's so many reasons to not do something, but like why not kind of take on a new challenge? And for me, just like you, we did 2 rides of about 60 miles, and that was it before we headed out. And neither of those rides were fully weighted, so I didn't actually feel the weight of my bike, like with all of the panniers and everything, until the day that we left to the train station to head out east to do the Trans Am. So I think the best training is just going out and doing it. I cannot stress the fact that literally anybody can do it. I mean, like truly anybody can do it. And you will find that, at least I found, that it'll be much harder in terms of a mental challenge than a physical one.
I think a lot of us along the way, because we haven't trained for it, we end up learning so much along the way. Like simple things like mailing what we don't need home. Are there any tips that you took away, or lessons that you learned?
Oh, they're kind of embarrassing, but yes. Like don't take a tripod with you like I did. Just take what you need and nothing else. And that's definitely, for someone that's never done it before, it's like you don't know what you'll need, right? But I definitely, not taking more than like 2 like bike outfits, like 2 shorts, 2 tops, or whatever. Also, like, don't worry so much about like where you're gonna end up staying. Like, I mean, it's good to like plan beforehand, but sometimes you either don't make it to your destination for XYZ reason, or I just feel like ultimately we were able to find a place to stay with no problem every time. In terms of packing, just pack light to the extent that you can, for sure. When we had sent about 3 packages home by the time that we reached Montana. And when we got to Montana, when we got to adventure cycling, they weigh your bikes. And at that time, I was carrying about 80-ish pounds, and my boyfriend was carrying 110. So that means that I was probably carrying like closer to what he was carrying, and he was carrying that much more before we had sent those 3 packages home. So it goes without saying that to the extent that you can limit, what you carry, that's definitely what I would do. I will say though, Austin and I are vegetarians. So, we had to take like a full on cooking set, because we had to, typically we had to buy food that you had to cook. Whereas, for folks that eat meat, going to the groceries or, whatever grocery store, or even to a 7-Eleven and getting a bunch of hot dogs or something, like it's just much easier. So yeah, it kind of depends on your situation. I think definitely taking an open mind with you. I mean, most of the Trans Am is, going through Middle America, like, nowhere land in some cases. Some towns that we stayed in with a population of like 19 or 32. And that was definitely eye-opening for me. I'm from Miami, and pretty much if I drive for like 10 minutes and I don't see people or buildings and industrialization, I feel like I'm out of my comfort zone in a way. But I definitely learned a lot through that, um, for better or worse. I will say that a big part of my feeling safe on um, on the trail was because I had Austin with me, and Austin is also a white man, and I think that dynamic, in some ways, made it safer. It goes without saying that even after having done it, I wouldn't do it alone, um, and I would fear even doing it with another woman or a trans or femme presenting person. Um, because on the East Coast, there was just a lot of places that I felt very uncomfortable in, um, or on the East side, I should say, like Kentucky, Virginia, in those areas. But yeah, they made me very fearful of like how I was being perceived, though at the same time, like the vast majority of people were incredibly nice and incredibly welcoming, and that we just felt so much gratitude for the most part. But there was still areas, um, where, you know, I definitely wouldn't have like gone to the bathroom if Austin wasn't like standing right outside, or, you know, whatever the case may be. So yeah, it's like you have to be very conscientious, but I would definitely urge people to kind of go with an open mind and just be willing to learn.
Yeah, you do learn a lot along the way, and it also
Yeah.
makes you realize like how little you need in life when you just end up shipping so much stuff home.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know, not only with, you know, cookware or clothing, but just, you know, I think I took like 2 or maybe 3 books with me, and didn't end up, you know, reading any of them. And I think I sent them all back, if I'm not mistaken. Not only because I didn't have like the time, by the time you just spend 10 hours or, you know, however many hours riding for the day, but it's also like there's just so many other things to like do, and like, you know, while you're on the trip, in the sense of just getting to know some of the hosts that we were staying with. You know, there were some places that we've camped that we've just never been to that area of the US, where it was, you know, we were just kind of marveling at like the geography, you know. Definitely going to like Missouri, for example, I did not expect for Missouri to be as beautiful as it was. And even, you know, we were living in Colorado, but when we were west of that, Idaho, Montana, like growing up in Miami, I always felt like those are areas that are like barren. I'm like, who lives in Wyoming, you know, and why? You know, that's how I felt. And in some ways they are, you know, not very densely populated areas, but they're just so like vast and beautiful. And um, yeah, I mean, you know, I felt like it was a gift to be there, and to be experiencing those places in that way. You know, it was very slow because we were on bikes. You know, you don't get that kind of experience if you're just driving through, staying at a hotel, and or, you know, whatever the case may be. So, um, yeah, I definitely was marveled at some of the geography and in the United States. I just didn't realize it was as beautiful as it was or is.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people make fun of like flyover country, and that was like
Hmm.
Kansas and Montana. That was some of my favorite places to bike just because of how like open it was
Yeah,
and like
yeah,
freeing.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to touch on your experience biking as a Black woman. You have written and recorded a podcast for Adventure Cycling a few months ago, Dynamo Jenny, where you said a very powerful statement that resonated with me. You were talking about how a lot of white cyclists, and mind you, you know, cyclists are mostly white, unfortunately, at least the ones
Mhm.
that are portrayed in the media and in the community. And so you were talking about how there's this narrative that we tell, and I myself am included in this, in terms of like telling this narrative that what we're doing, like our lifestyle, is a sacrifice without really acknowledging the fact that it is a privilege to do this in white skin. And so like riding a bicycle, I think, is such a vulnerable act as a default.
Mhm.
And just because you're
Mhm.
like so exposed to the nature and like people who you meet, So I'm wondering if you can speak to what it's like to have that like added layer of vulnerability as a Black woman who's cycling.
Yeah, it's a great question because it's something that I think about not only with cycling, but in a lot of different spaces that I occupy. Um, yeah, I understand this idea of sacrifice and where it comes from and why it's salient for people doing this, kind of as you already alluded to. Um, Obviously, if we were to, for example, get into a crash with a car, like we would be much worse off than the driver, right? But yeah, in talking about cycling, I immediately think of it as being more emblematic of an immense privilege before a sacrifice. And when I say privilege, it's not only the privilege of like race and but also just the privilege of choice. Like this idea that you have a choice, that you can pick the kind of transportation that you want to take to work. You can pick, what you want to do for fitness, and you have the time for it to care for yourself the way that a lot of people, whose conditions, their material conditions and their circumstances determine their lifestyle. You get to choose your lifestyle. And in some cases, especially as we talk about class, so do I, right? I had this privilege of going across the country. Who has 3 months off to just go off and do that, right? So I think about that a lot because it brings up a lot of guilt for me, especially I grew up, very, very low income. And, compared to my family, I've had a lot of different experiences that they haven't. And I think a part of it is, there's this quote, I always forget the person's name, but I feel like it triggered actually a lot of opinion pieces. And she's essentially talking about like the immigrant experience, which essentially is mine. My parents are from Dominican Republic, and me and my brother are the only ones to have been born in the US, my family, my immediate family. So, the quote is about this idea of our parents, having had to make so much sacrifice, and they were tasked with like surviving, and we are tasked with like self-actualization, and this idea that I can do something that is fulfilling for me in a way that my parents have never lived a day in their lives. They have survived every day. So because of that, it's difficult for me to think of biking as a sacrifice because I have never known sacrifice of that magnitude. And sorry.
No.
I just think that with cycling, it's kind of given me this freedom that I've never felt that I was like allowed to experience. But even then, as a Black person in a very homogenous sport, living in Colorado, there's a very homogenous state. It's difficult to navigate the spaces because, when we're talking about like diversity, equity, and inclusion within cycling, a lot of people take, they're defensive about it because, they feel like just ride your bike, like just go out and do it, like no matter who you are. So they don't realize that it's not so much that people are outwardly discriminating against you, like other cyclists, as much as it's, you did not expect me in this world, not in your cycling club, not in your bike shop, not in anything. The people at REI are not expecting a bunch of Black cyclists to come through. Like that's just not the case. And I don't mean that in a deficient way, like of what Black people or other people don't do. I just mean like that has not been the nature of like different adventure sports, and especially with cycling or just, certain spaces that relates to recreation. So yeah, I think for me, whether I'm on my bike or I'm at work or I'm at the grocery store, I don't have the privilege of forgetting that I'm a Black woman. I can't, because people will remind me very quickly that I am. So yeah, anytime. So I always think about this with having biked across the country with Austin, because you know, he probably was like, you know, let's make sure that there is a big enough shoulder in the space, or let's make sure that, you know, our technology is charged, you know, for the, you know, to make sure that we know where we're going and that kind of thing. Where I'm like, let me hope to God that in the next corner, I don't find like a racist person like wanting to shoot me. Like that's what I'm thinking of. So like not only with that, I also think about it when, you know, I'm riding alone, and that's why I try so hard not to ride alone, because I just never know how I'm perceived. And I've had I think an easier time than a lot of people navigating that. Like you know, I'm not trying to pretend that you know, every day of my life someone's being like outwardly discriminatory toward me, but you learn, you know, through our racial socialization, you learn very quickly that other people may perceive you in different ways, and or treat you in different ways and behave toward you in different ways. And yeah, I just always have that in the back of my mind. And I think that's where, you know, Black Girls Do Bike kind of came on. And I guess, yeah, I guess at some point we'll talk about that, but having that refuge has been so important and has shifted the way that I see cycling now, because when I'm riding with other Black women, it feels, there's like this liberation that comes on of like, I don't have to like fit this mold. Like I can just be me, and, you know, in a full sense, like holistically, with everything that that brings. And I don't have to like be whatever people envision a cyclist to be. I could just be myself and ride my bike because I enjoy it. And it doesn't have to be more than that, you know, like that is like worthwhile in itself.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think it's like such a powerful realization for people to hear that basically it's like white people are more like you were saying with your partner Austin, like we have the privilege of just worrying more about logistics, where you're worrying about how you come across. And I think I read someone's comment on like, I forgot if it was adventure cycling or not, but this Black man who is a bike tourist, he commented on when adventure cycling, they posted like their statement on Black Lives Matter a few months ago. And he said like his biggest fear is just riding a bike with with a mask on, you know, and how that puts him like in a more vulnerable state. And I think that's just things that we don't even realize. Yeah. And I'm wondering if there's any like extra precautions or like considerations that you have to take when you go on these trips that you think about.
For me, I think, yeah, I mean, in certain ways, like I mentioned, like you know, I wouldn't go into like, I wouldn't want to go into, you know, a bathroom or whatever, like by myself, or into like a 7-Eleven or whatever it was that we were in, which was very difficult because we had our bikes, right? So like someone had to like stay outside, and it was just like difficult because again, it's not just when I'm cycling. Like even now, sometimes we'll drive to go on a hike, for example, and, you know, my partner will get dumped on the car if I go to a 7-Eleven in like a smaller town. Ultimately it's, and I hate to say smaller town because it's not to say that there's, you know, people aren't racist in large towns. There very much are, but there's, I think the fear becomes like heightened and a little bit more salient in areas that you're just not familiar with. And that's how it was cycling, particularly, like I said, on some of the eastern states where it's just decorated with Confederate flags. And that was a difficult one for me. They were just everywhere. And I didn't know like what was safe, like what they were trying to communicate. Also, at the very least, even if they were nice to me, like I'm very fearful of guns and have always been. So like staying in places that had Confederate flag, you know, there was one, I forget what they call it. But essentially a hostel that was for cyclists. And there was some hikers too that stayed there in Virginia. I forget the town now, but there, as soon as we came in, just massive, larger than me, a big Confederate flag. And, I think about that in hindsight because I'm like, well, you saw that flag and you stayed there. So, like what made you not go somewhere else? And yeah, it's kind of conflicting in certain ways because the person that owned the house was perfectly nice to me, but how someone may behave toward you may not necessarily reflect kind of like the deeper, more profound ways in which somebody can like harbor discriminatory kind of thoughts. And anyway, also with like the guns, I was thinking to myself, like, there are probably guns in this house. And like, what does that mean about my safety as a Black person, as a woman, as a cyclist, and as a person that's all I had, right? If I wanted to like go somewhere, I had to like just ride my bike to get there. I didn't have any other option. So yeah, for me, like my comfort was really like having Austin, and like he was my safety net in a way.
Yeah, it's crazy how you like, when I biked across the country, I feel like what I remember the most and what Miles of Portraits is based on is just the kindness of strangers, and how we did it right after the election. And it was nice to see the fact that like people are still kind, and you just meet all these wonderful people across the country. But then like on the other end of that, you also see all these Confederate flags, and you realize like how much racism is still alive in this country, and how like how I feel like I live in a bubble in New York City and I don't realize that.
Right. But I think that yeah, I had a lot of kind of conflicting thoughts and emotions around that while I was on it, because people were, like I said, so generous. Like, I mean, just like so generous. But I had one experience in Kansas with a woman that saw myself in Austin. We were camping at a park. And because she saw us, she decided to go out and get us some like Gatorades. She didn't say anything. She just went out and got them, came back and just gave us, and I think some other snacks, I don't remember now. And I was just like, oh my God, like I was just like so touched. We were just, she was kind of asking like, what are you all doing? Like, and we spoke to her about it. And long story short, ultimately she starts talking, I don't know if it was about her daughter or her niece or something like that. And this was in Eureka, Kansas. She's saying that whoever it was, her niece or her daughter, that went to Kansas State, and that that kind of opened up her world and like meeting other people outside of her town. And she started dating like a Latino person. And and for her it was just kind of very concerning that essentially she was essentially trying to get to the fact that she doesn't understand why people date people of other races. She's telling me, a Black woman, this while I'm sitting next to my white partner, and she went and got us these Gatorades. So it's those things where, yeah, sure, people are nice, so people can act nice. It doesn't mean they're not racist. Like or a lot of people think that like liberals aren't racist, or whatever it is, like what their idea is, that you have to be like actively murdering someone to be racist, and that's just not how that goes. It's a very like profound and learned and almost epigenetic thing, and socialized thing. Anyway, just all that to say that I did struggle with that, with what I felt was like unmerited generosity that I experienced with so many people, allowing me in their home, like giving me all kinds of things, going out of their way to help me, while also potentially harboring these kinds of like sentiments.
It's funny that you mentioned that story in Kansas, because we actually had a similar experience. I forgot the name of the town, but we stayed with a man who called himself Pastor Joe, and he was actually you stayed with him.
Oh yes.
Yeah,
I think that's everyone's most memorable memory.
Yeah. We were questioning the whole time whether or not we would, like, if we should leave or not, but he was just preaching about the rapture and like saying all these homophobic things, but we just kind of
we didn't get that actually.
Oh, you didn't?
Yeah, he wasn't hateful, but he was saying very absurd, truly absurd things.
I hope adventure
Yeah.
cycling took him off the map by now. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your experience being one of the leaders for the Denver Solidarity Rides. So if you can
Mhm.
just talk to that experience.
Yeah, sure. So that was actually started by someone that's on this call. Her name is Emily Kleinfelter. Um, she's, I think she works with like city planning, and she started it in June. That was the first one. Um, and ultimately, I think she just wanted to like elevate the voices of like Black cyclists. And she reached out, I want to say it was to Major Taylor, so to the local cycling club, Major Taylor here. And through them, because we've interacted, Black Girls Do Bike has interacted with Major Taylor. I think they were like, oh, and let's welcome Stephanie. I think that's when she was learning about um, our group and that kind of stuff. So that's how I ended up getting involved with it. I think she reached out to me on like that Monday or Tuesday, and the ride was like that Saturday. And she had asked me if I could lead and say a few words, and I specifically said, I can help lead. And I didn't want to speak because I felt like very nervous about it. And ultimately I did, and I have for all the rides that we've done. So yeah, that's the first one was June 13th, I believe. And we've done 5 since then. Both the first and the last one were very well attended. Like over like 200 cyclists were with us, which was huge, at least for us. But yeah, so the essence of that was riding in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. So that's kind of what those have been about, and they've been very special to me because Denver has, a big cycling culture. So it was great to be able to meld, activism with cycling. And there was a lot of Black Lives Matter marches and protests here in Denver, as there were elsewhere. But being able to ride, we were able to cover, so much longer distances. And also like go through different neighborhoods, and some, sometimes we would kind of pass through more underserved neighborhoods and communities, but oftentimes we were going to more like affluent neighborhoods because we felt like those were the people that really needed to hear our message. And also going through places of commerce where, despite COVID, there were some people still, eating out, going to restaurants and things of that sort. And those are the folks that we wanted to elevate the message around. And Emily always described it as kind of like we were like a moving billboard, and I definitely felt like that's kind of metaphorically what we were doing. And then ultimately, as we continued to organize more, we were really trying to make them more tangible and effective, because building awareness is great. I think at this point, I feel like people are aware, about these protests. It's kind of hard not to know about them. So we were really trying to make our efforts a little bit more tactile. The fifth one, we ultimately did a fundraiser, and we were able to raise like over $2,000, and we donated it to the Denver chapter of Black Lives Matter. And we also have this like support page for tons of different like organizations and GoFundMe's that people could donate to and support, as well as like people to follow on Instagram, like podcasts, texts, different books and things that people could read as it relates to not only like equity and inclusion within cycling, but also just organizations that support Black lives in general. So yeah, it was, it's a very interesting time to be out there, because there's, again, as you kind of alluded to, this vulnerability of being a cyclist added with the vulnerability of just existing as a Black person. And yeah, melding those two. And it was really interesting too, because of course it was about Black Lives Matter in general, but in some ways it was also about the way that, like bike police, and there's a lot of talk right now about the way that Trek as a brand, how their bikes are used by police officers, often to harass cyclists, among other people. So it kind of felt like I was, all of those issues were kind of brought to the fore within these protests. And also it felt like a way of, because it was, co-led by a number of people, but at the front you typically saw the few Black cyclists, be it myself, other people from Major Taylor, the Skid Marks Bike Club. We were kind of at the front for the most part, and it felt very declaratory in a way.
Yeah, I think what you said is really powerful, and just the fact that like when you're on a bike, you just cover so much more of a distance than you do if you were
Right.
marching. So you get like
Hmm.
more of a taste of the city and the neighborhoods that you go through.
Right. Yeah, we were going through a lot of very like gentrified places too. It's an area
Mm.
called Five Points that was it's a historically Black area of Denver that is now very much not. Um, and it was evident to people like how um, the differences in adequacy and infrastructure and all those kinds of things were services were just different in different areas that we went through, and yeah, it's not as easy to see, be it driving or walking or whatever it may be.
Well, could you tell us a little bit about Black Girls Do Bike and how you came about becoming the leader of that?
Yeah, so while I was on the ride on the TransAm in 2016, that's when it started becoming very apparent that there were no, I think I met two women the whole time, and definitely no Black people. So, and not very many people of color in general, if I'm remembering accurately. So anyway, it became like very salient to me that that's when I kind of started thinking like, wow, there could very well be a chance that I may be the first Black woman to be doing this. So I ended up finishing and came back, but that thought never kind of left my mind. And my partner, ironically, was through Instagram, I think is where he learned about Black Girls Do Bike, and he had just shown it to me. And I went to go join the Denver chapter, and I saw that there wasn't one. So I just kind of left it at that. But ultimately, I decided I feel like I should do something about this. So I kind of reached out and I went on the website and I saw that the only real requirement is to just lead because it's a national organization for the folks that may not be aware. So it's a national organization with, I think at this point, like more than 80 or 90 chapters. So anyway, when I went on the website, I saw that there was, no Denver chapter. And when I saw the requirements, it just said lead one monthly ride. And I was like, I can do that. I still don't really have like too big of a community here. So I was fearful of like, well, how many people am I going to get around this? But ultimately through like word of mouth and some poaching, by poaching, I mean, I went on, we have a chapter of like Black Girls Run and we have like Outdoor Afro here. And, I kind of reached out to them and said, can I do a 110 post about my chapter that I'm trying to get started? And, now we have a little bit over 200 members, something like that. So yeah, that's essentially how it got started. I just decided that since it didn't already exist, that I had to kind of create that space myself. And so our first ride was July 2017. So we're a little over 3 years old now. And yeah, the whole purpose is to encourage more Black women, to get on bikes. And whatever that may look like, whether you are a triathlete, whether you race, whether you're a mountain biker, whether you just commute to work, or you have a huffy and you go out with your children once every 6 years, whatever that may look like. The essence is that we just want to get more people on bikes, especially Black women, trans femme, non-binary folks, getting out there. And also for me, it's not only about representation. It's also about like building community, and also it's kind of, it gives us the opportunity to take authorship of our own narratives. And that's why I've always liked the name that Monica gave it, because it is declaratory just in itself. Like Black Girls Do Bike, like we are out here. Like, yes, you may not see us, and yes, that may be very intentional from bike companies that forget we exist, but we do exist. And whether we're in the minority or not, cycling is something that is universal. And I think a lot of people don't know the histories And when they do, it's limited to Major Taylor, but they don't know, a lot about the Buffalo Soldiers. They don't know about the way that Black women have historically used bicycles um, in the United States. And even myself, it's something that I had to learn. And especially because, again, I started cycling in some ways kind of by accident. It's definitely not something that I grew up with. It's not something that was like deeply ingrained. It wasn't something that I did with my family. It's not even something that my friends did. Still to this day, my friends have no idea why I do this. Like they just don't get it. And not only the tour, it's also like, oh, you're gonna go out and ride 40 miles on your bike? Like, why do that when you could, not do that? This is just not their idea of fun. It's not their idea of even fitness. They will go to a gym and train before they would go on a bike. So that's my mission, to kind of bring it to people like me that could not have cared less about cycling and this world. And I do that because of the freedom that I felt like I've gotten from it, and the joy that I feel like cycling brings, and the challenges, and always kind of wanting to make yourself better. And that's something that I feel like eludes a lot of Black people and other people of color in those communities. Like, we often don't have to, kind of going back to this idea of sacrifice, like unfortunately, when it comes to opportunities and wealth, that is conflated with race in this country. Black people do have less assets and less, economic, their conditions are disparate compared to white people in this country, or the average. So that being said, that constrains our ability to do different things. And I think with that, it's also like a matter of like dignity. Like, we don't have the freedom to like do something that we find fulfilling. And I don't want to speak like holistically as everyone, because obviously I have this opportunity now, but I didn't grow up with it. And even as I'm saying this, most of my family does not have this opportunity, right? Like, if you have 2 or 3 jobs and you need to make ends meet, you don't have time to go ride your bike for fun, much less get the state-of-the-art bike that weighs 2 ounces and whatever it is that a lot of cyclists like care about. And like, cycling is an expensive sport, so ultimately, like, that's going to, regardless of race, it's going to determine who's able to do it and who isn't. So that's a huge consideration, as well as, again, safety, infrastructure. Like, when it comes to city planning, is like, what areas of town are prioritized to get new protected bike lanes. It's not typically Black or Latinx or minoritized populations. So anyway, now I don't even know where I'm going with that. I forget what your original question was. I think it was about Black Girls Do Bike. But yeah, it's been 3 years, and it's awesome. It's amazing to really have been able to carve that out for the community here in Denver. And yeah, it's been a really rewarding experience. And just seeing so many people challenge themselves in different ways, bringing their children out. I just recently did a ride where one of the participants was finally able to bring her daughter out, and she's always kind of twisting her arm and she never wants to do it, but she finally came out, and that was great. We're really trying. I have 2 new co-sheroes, so co-leaders. So we're really trying to increase our reach and our our visibility and that kind of thing. And we're hoping to get different fleets to introduce people to mountain biking for those that haven't done that. And if cycling, regular road cycling is expensive, mountain biking is even worse. So at least being able to give some of those opportunities, even if they're short term, for some of our participants, like, that's really gratifying. And yeah, just being able to welcome people from all different walks of life to this world of cycling is really gratifying.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's so important, the work that you're doing, and just the fact that, like you said, 200 girls are signed up for Black Girls Do Bike, the Denver chapter.
Yeah, a little over 200. Wow. I think it was last month that we got to the 200 mark. Yeah,
that's incredible.
And that's small, all things considered. There are chapters. I want to say like the Atlanta chapter has like over 1,000 or something like that.
Yeah, it just shows like the need that there is for this community. Well, we're getting towards the end of the interview, I'd have one more question for you before we jump into Q&A. If you have like one message for anyone who's kind of like on the fence to do adventure cycling, what that message would be, or if you want to just answer the question, why do you ride?
Oh yeah. Yes, if anyone is interested in bike touring, I mean, like I said earlier, I can't stress the extent to which like truly anyone can do this. You know, I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't train or that you shouldn't be like, you shouldn't plan it, you know, and try to be like kind of systematic about it. But ultimately, it's just so fun. It's going to be one, I am convinced, I'm only 28 and I'm still convinced that it's the most important thing I've ever done and will ever do in my life. I think that everyone deserves to do something like that. And, you know, maybe it doesn't have to be across the country, but it's such a rewarding experience in ways that you can't even imagine. That I just hope that there are more people that do this, particularly Black women and girls. I just really hope that it becomes in some ways a little bit more normalized, which it's not only the doing the tour part, but also that their conditions allow for it. So yeah, I'm very hopeful that one day we'll get to that point. So anyone that is interested, reach out to me. I'm happy to talk about like logistics and maps and what to wear and you know what kind of tent to buy. I mean, there are a lot of different considerations, especially the time of the year, the kind of tour, the kind of geography. You know, what kind of bike do you need? You know, what kind of speed? Like, do you take another tube? Do you take another tire? You know, there's a lot of pieces to it, but it's certainly doable and like slowly but surely. Like for us, at least, it kind of took essentially a year of planning and reading, and there's enough testimonies out there and people documenting their experiences that yeah, it goes without saying that people can prepare well enough to be able to do something like this. I mean, thousands of people do it, so there's no reason. Well, there are many reasons as to why you can't do something like this, but if your circumstances allow, then you should absolutely take on something like this. So my biggest takeaway is do it, or my biggest message, I guess, for the people interested is you know, there's so many reasons not to do something. So ultimately, if you're, you know, they just don't let your fears kind of dictate how you move or how you navigate in the world. And that's a very difficult thing to say, again, with everything that I talked about racism. It's like I can't not have that fear, but you know, I think it's such a rewarding experience in the sense of how much you learn about yourself and the fortitude and grit that you can ultimately characterize will be gratifying in immense ways, and you'll definitely remember this for the rest of your life. And then in terms of like why I ride, I mean, so many reasons. I think a part of it is me wanting to like, again, like change this narrative, not only of like who cycles and who doesn't, but also of like of myself. Like I have these self-imposed like barriers of what spaces I belong in or that I don't, and like who's expecting me and who isn't, and like what this says about me, and the kind of challenges that I want to take on. And even though it kind of happened by accident, I just kind of felt enamored with it so quickly. And I think a lot of, you ask any cyclist, I feel like they say that, you know, they share that sentiment that they just like, they just start riding and they just want to keep going. And you learn that in the tour too. At first we were averaging like 30-35 miles. We set out to average about 50 miles a day. I was going so slow because I just did not have the strength. Then by the time, you know, we were kind of like in Kansas and everything past that, we were doing 60, 70, 90 mile days. The longest day on the tour was 118 miles, the longest I've done still to this day. So anyway, you'll find freedom that you don't find in a lot of different activities, or I think in our society in general. So I think, being able to kind of pedal and just like feeling self-sufficient, feeling like you can cover like so many distances and you can see your own communities and your surroundings in a way that other vehicles for transportation just don't allow. It's liberating, it's fun, it keeps you fit. I mean, there's just no like negative element to it. It's helpful for the environment. I mean, nothing but pros, I feel like, when it comes to cycling. And just think, I always joke that like you will never see a cyclist frowning. Like that just doesn't exist. So anyway.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. I think we're going to jump into Q&A. Eric, do you have any questions from people?
Thank you so much for that. It is inspiring in lots of different ways. And if anyone wants to ask questions directly to Stephanie, leave them in the chat. But I think, one thing to kick it off, it's interesting because I think a lot of the speakers, whether it's a physical barrier or emotional barrier, there is some sort of barrier that's a real concern, and I heard that in kind of your talk of how do you acknowledge this, but then also move forward. And so it seems like one place you've done that is in this position of leadership to kind of like build yourself up through Black Girls Do Ride, or Do Bike. And I know someone asked Leo at the beginning of this summit, like, do you have any tips for leadership? And then also maybe also like filling yourself up with energy, because committing yourself to others also can be a lot, and that's what I heard in like your talks where you're like, if I have to explain myself, it's always so much. And so like, how do you actually keep up that energy and inspire others?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. And the reason I'm smiling is because I'm just like so busy and worn out all the time. So in some ways it's like, definitely like know your limits and like your capacity for sure. But interestingly, like cycling is one of those things that helps with that. Yeah, so I think I am just very drawn to doing things that like matter to me. Like ultimately, like if something fundamentally matters to me, I just feel compelled to do something about it. For better or worse, like even if my bandwidth is like very low, I still, it's hard for me to say no, and that's not a good habit to have. So some people are very surprised when I tell them I'm a full-time graduate student. I work full-time, I lead these rides. I've helped with the solidarity rides. Like I'm a appointed city commissioner. Like I just have so much stuff happening, but all of it is so like fundamentally important or necessary for me to be part of. And they've just been such great learning opportunities that I just kind of jump on it. So it's hard actually, to this question of like leadership, can you advise your recommendations? Because I feel like in some ways, perhaps it's been nurtured in some ways, but in other ways, I feel like it's just kind of my nature. Because like I said, like with Black Girls Do Bike, it was just very much like, oh, there's not a chapter, I have to create it. I just kind of felt like it's something that I had to do. I think a part of it is like internalizing responsibility. And because I'm so kind of public service oriented, I feel like that is like my driver, this idea of like helping people or helping society writ large, right? Like, so through my research, through my work, through cycling, through these protest rides, like it's all, my motivations for them ultimately is all the same. It's the same drivers for all of the different initiatives that I take on. But ultimately, I think it's really kind of putting yourself in those positions that perhaps you didn't see yourself occupying and just being willing to learn. I think that's, when it comes to leadership, that's ultimately what it boils down to. Just making sure that you're receptive and that you're open to learning different things, but also of challenging yourself. Kind of not having expectations that everything is going to be taught to you. It's really about like kind of taking initiative. And yeah, I think I've been kind of successful in that, but I also set kind of really high bar for myself of what I expect to accomplish. And maybe that's another thing folks can do, is just set the bar higher than you thought and try your best to, work to achieve it.
I love that. And it's like, even within, there's so many things, but even within that, you were saying, you're vegetarian, and a lot of things I've been thinking about is just like, what can I personally take responsibility for that will slowly lead progress towards whatever it is, because ultimately, like, we're in control of ourselves, and it's just like amazing to hear how much is on your plate and you're still
Yeah.
looking for ways to show up and give back. And I was going through your Instagram and I'm like, and here's a fundraiser, and it's, but often you can't choose not to be an advocate in that way, and it's really commendable to hear that. And see you on Dynamo Jenny. It's like, you're out there.
Yeah, I'm trying. I'm very grateful for the platforms that I've been given to even be able to share these stories. And I was telling Annalisa early on that sometimes I feel like I'm just kind of repeating the same things because, everybody wants to know about like me touring, and I'm perfectly happy to share them, but sometimes it's hard because I still somewhat feel like an imposter, and I feel like, do I have something worthwhile to share with people? And yeah, see, exactly that person, Nancy's response to that, it's like, yeah, absolutely. Anyway, and I hope that other people feel that way too. And that's why the one reason why I do like to be able to share about cycling is because I'm such a normie. Like, I don't race. I am not, I'm not this stellar athlete. I'm not anything that you couldn't, I am the average person that is in line with you at the grocery store. So, I really just, I just want, the average person to feel like they have the capacity, to be able to do things like this, and also that they deserve these kinds of experiences.
That's what we have. I was like, there's also always like, what are you doing next? But I'm also like, COVID's been like a great time for pausing and relaxing, and so I think it's just commendable to use this time to kind of refocus and just bring everyone together. And like, there's so many things that you said that resonate. We were just talking to Javier before that, and he's talking about the immigrant experience, but even just you ending saying like, I'm out here because it's fun. It's like, it's such a beautiful thing about the bike that makes it really unique.
Right. It's it's very liberating, and it does bring, I feel like, so many different communities together in different ways. That I think it is a beautiful thing. I wish that in some ways it were more equitable, like in the industry, but it goes without saying that I've met so many wonderful people that wouldn't even consider themselves cyclists, but that still are able to partake in cycling, and yeah, it's beautiful. I've met so many people through it, and yeah, it's been a very meaningful part of my life. I did see one question that I just want to quickly address, because someone said,
Yeah.
warm showers, and I did. I stayed at like 4 or 5 of them, and it was amazing. Being able to stay indoors for one, and people were again so kind, and like being able to take a shower and bring the bike indoors too, where you don't have to fear what happens to it. But yeah, for those that don't know, it's an app. It's essentially like couch surfing, but for cyclists. So yeah, I do recommend using that.
Yeah, we're big fans of warm showers too. It's really amazing like how much people open their homes to you just because you both have like a love for the bicycle,
Yeah. My partner joked that he's like, when we go back to Denver, I want to move somewhere where we're on the trail so that we can kind of give back in that way. So
yeah, that'd be fun. Yeah, I think we can end there. But thank you so much, Stephanie. This was so great. Where can people find more about you?
So I have a number of different pieces that I've kind of written about this experience. So one was on Aisha McGowan's blog, and that's quickbrownfox.com. Then also on the Adventure Cycling blog, on the Dynamo Journey podcast. And so if anyone's interested in like Black Girls Do Bike Denver, we're on Facebook, and now recently on Instagram, actually. So on Facebook, it's just Black Girls Do Bike, Denver. And then on Instagram, it's BGDB, Black Girls Do Bike. So BGDB Denver. And we just recently got that. So we're definitely trying to, that's one of the ways in which we want to increase our outreach. So by all means, you're welcome to follow us on there. Then I also have my private or personal Instagram, which is the letter I, Steph, as in Stephanie, and then Meister. So I, Steph Meister. And I'm on Twitter, Stephanie Puello. Yeah, I'm kind of all over the place. But yeah, that's most as you know, with cycling related things. That's, if you follow Pro iZUMi, you may see a picture of me every now and then.
Yeah, you're all over the place. Well, thank you so much again, Stephanie.
Yeah, of course.
Great to have you on.
I appreciate it. Happy to, you know, just be able to kind of talk about these things. You know, I always say that cycling is such a small part of my life, in the sense that like I have all these other things going, but ultimately it's a very large part, an important part of my life. So just like to be able to kind of talk about my different experiences, and glad that there are people out there that want to hear it.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for attending. And just to let you know, we have another interview. Actually, it's not an interview, it's a presentation. Olivia Round is going to be presenting about her TransAm bike trip across the country. She's a women's bicycling advocate who is a great writer and contributor to adventure cycling. And she talks a lot about overcoming fear through adventure. She's a great speaker, so I recommend it. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.